Thank you, Joe. And now I'll call on Professor Zimbalist.
So the last time that I competed with Joe was about 15 years ago. We used to have a Tuesday afternoon tennis match all the time, and it's nice to, given my advanced age, it's nice not to be doing that and instead to have some verbal confrontation. Look, you know, and by the way, a lot's been said, so I'll cut my remarks shorter. I agree fundamentally with everything that Matt Mitten said. But, you know, I think all of us on the panel acknowledge that there's hypocrisy in college sports, there's economic exploitation in college sports, there's injustice in college sports. The question is, how do you fix it, or how do you make it a little bit better? And there are two basic choices you can make. You can say, okay, we'll give in, it's already commercialized, let's create a full-blown market system for those schools that want to do that. And another way you can go is to say, let's see if we can make the educational model work and hold the NCAA to the fire around some of the things that it says it's all about. Can we reform the system in that way? Let me go from there to make a few comments about why I think it's extremely problematic to move towards the pay-for-play model. One of them is you have to answer the question where the money is going to come from. The last NCAA report, the Revenues and Expenses report, in FBS, has the median deficit of athletic programs at $14.7 million. That's on an operating basis. That's before you count most capital expenses and some other indirect expenses. The NCAA has another report out that says the typical FBS school has the equivalent of $25 million a year in capital expenses. So you're talking about deficits run out of athletic programs that are above $20 and $30 million a year. Now, it might be true, as Vince, and I thought Vince did a very nice job presenting some possible alternatives, but in his alternative, he says the wage costs are going to be about $2 million a year. Now, it might be true that Ohio State can easily afford that. It might be true that Wisconsin and Michigan can. But the median revenue in football in the FBS, the top 128 football schools, is $21 million. It's not $100 million plus, which a lot of the Big Ten schools have. Moreover, if you start paying college athletes, you then have to deal with workman's compensation, unemployment compensation, payroll taxes that are paid both by the school and by the athlete, income taxes paid by the athlete, the possible loss of a myriad of tax preferences that college sports today presently benefits from. So you all know about this. The boosters put down $10,000 and they get the right to buy seats on the 50-yard line or the 40-yard line, and they get to deduct 80% of that from their federal income taxes. UBIT taxation, unrelated business income taxation. There's a fragmentation principle there which would allow the IRS to tax signage revenue at Ohio Stadium and other forms of revenue. They decide not to do that. College football teams and basketball teams get to issue tax-exempt bonds. All of these things are up for reevaluation if you move to a pay-for-play model. There's a lot there. It's not just the $2 million that you're going to pay in Vince's model. There are a lot of other costs that are going to fall both on the athlete and on the university. I also agree with Matt wholeheartedly when he says the truth is that there's a handful of athletes on a typical FBS football team or basketball team that are the real stars, who are the ones who are being economically exploited in the most significant way by getting a scholarship that's worth $50,000 or $60,000 a year. Because those are the ones, there aren't very many of them, but those are the ones who are going to go to the pros, and they're going to start getting in basketball an average salary of $5.5 million a year, in football $3 million a year. And they're getting a scholarship worth $60,000. At the college level, if professional athletes are compensated at 50% of the league's revenue, at the college level, these people, instead of getting, these athletes, instead of getting, if it were a market system, instead of getting $6 million in the NFL, they would be getting $2 or $3 million in the NCAA. So they are exploited economically. They're the ones who I worry about in terms of economic exploitation, except they don't worry that much, because they're the same ones And Maurice Claret is an exception to this. There are exceptions to this. But they're the same ones who are going to go on and play in the pros in another year or two and make the $6 million a year. So I don't think that the going to a pay-for-play model solves many economic problems at all. I think it's also important to look a little bit at the economic landscape of college sports. One of the reasons why college sports has grown economically so much in the last 15 or 20 years is because there's been a sustained and pronounced boom in television revenue. I think that's over. There are many, many changes that are going on in telecommunications technology today that I think are undermining the value of sports rights. And we see it all over the place. I don't have a lot of time to talk about it now, but I'd be happy to talk about it in discussion. But briefly, we have the phenomenon of cord cutting, phenomenon of cord shaving, the phenomenon of cord nevers. People are not subscribing to expanded basic cable packages the way they used to, which is why that Vincent's ESPN is cutting back staff, which is why that Fox Sports is cutting back staff, which is why Steve Ballmer, who paid $2 billion for the Clippers thinking he was going to get a Lakers television contract, hasn't been able to find that contract, which is why the Dodgers can't get their games on television in LA and the Yankees can't get their games on Comcast in New York. It's hitting the wall. And although there's a Big Ten network that's been very successful, I don't think you're going to see growing revenue, and I think in the future you're going to see shrinking revenue. So not only do you have this problem with deficits, large deficits, but I think they're going to get worse. And part of the problem there, by the way, is institutional. Part of the problem is that these programs that are so heavily commercialized don't have stockholders like normal corporations do. You don't have stockholders who say, we want to see a profit at the end of the quarter, so the price of the stock goes up. What you have instead in college sports are shareholders or stakeholders whose goal is not to have a profit, whose goal is to have a team that wins. And that's the message that the athletic director gets. So the athletic director, if more revenue comes in, the athletic director finds a way to build a $40 million indoor football stadium, finds a way to have new training centers, and finds a way to spend more on recruiting. So it's almost impossible, given the institutional structure within which college sports operates, to generate surpluses in the in the athletics programs. So I think it makes more sense, if we're concerned about athlete well-being, it makes more sense to talk about reforms along these lines. Schools should provide medical care and pay for the medical care for college athletes that has long-term coverage for disabilities that are suffered when they're in school. That schools should pay for insurance that gives athletes who have disabilities suffered from playing college athletics, covers them for income replacement for what they would have been able to earn if they had been able to go to the pros and had not been disabled. I think we can have reforms that provide athletes with due process. That doesn't have to stay the same the way it's been in the NCAA. We can have rules that say, let's redefine what it means to be an amateur. An amateur is something, the definition that the NCAA has used for amateurism has morphed over the years. It morphs at their convenience. But I think that most of us understand an amateur to mean somebody who doesn't get paid for playing an activity. So fine, for me, that's fine. I'm willing to go with that activity, that definition of amateurism. But what that means is that there's no reason for the NCAA to tell a student athlete that he or she can't have an agent to talk about the possible benefits of going pro or the strategy for going pro. It means that the NCAA can't say to the student, if you enter a professional draft, you can't come back, you lose your eligibility. It should mean that they can't impose the restrictions that they do on transfer payments. And it should mean that athletes should be able to go out and get endorsement income or licensing income from activity outside of playing on the field or the basketball court. So I think there are meaningful reforms that can address some of the economic injustices that we have without going to an open system of pay-for-play. The people who are endorsing the pay-for-play model, as Joe has done and as Vince has done, I think quite rightly, other than saying I'm in favor of it, it's very hard to know where to go. Joe has backed off of his salary cap idea. You can't do that without collective bargaining. There's no non-statutory labor exemption to allow you to do that. And Vince wants to go to a tier model. Intellectually, there's nothing wrong with that idea. How are you going to do it? Who's going to decide that that's what you're doing? Who gets to decide that? Is it the NCAA? Is it a bunch of college commissioners? Is it President Obama? Is it students associations who decide that? It's very hard to know what system should emerge. And at the end of the day, you're still exploiting the stars. The star athletes, the star quarterbacks, and the star centers who are producing millions of dollars in value for your team, you can give them $40,000 and say you've got a good system? And then your second-string linebacker is going to get $10,000 or $20,000 above the COA, which is well above what that person's marginal revenue product is. That solves a problem? I don't think so. So there's some real issues. Other than saying pay for play sounds nice, and it deals with exploitation, there's some real issues about how do you get there, what do you do? And frankly, I think that Matt's model, although he didn't fully lay it out, makes as much sense as any. Let me just end with one comment about branding. This debate almost always includes a discussion about, well, what happens to the brand of college sports if we do away with amateurism, if we pay the athletes? And there'll be one side that vociferously claims it's going to undermine, and this is what the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals basically said. If we pay the athletes more than the COA, then it's going to undermine the brand. People aren't going to be interested in it anymore. It's going to be like minor league baseball. So some people will be interested in it, but it won't have the commercial value that it currently has. And then there are other people who say, that's nonsense. We professionalized the Olympics, and people still like the Olympics. We professionalized golf and tennis way back in the 60s, and people still follow those sports, so why can't we do that with college sports? There's actually an interesting and involved discussion we can have about that, but I just want to posit to you that we don't know what's going to happen to the brand. I don't know if one side is right or the other, and I think probably whatever damage might or might not happen to the brand will have a lot to do with what system we end up with and how we transition from where we are to that new system. Thank you.